Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank the chairwoman for holding this hearing focused on properties that the federal government manages. The General Services Administration, or GSA, manages roughly 9,000 federally owned properties and private sector leases in all 50 states and territories. Federal real estate is what makes it possible for the civil service to serve the American people. This is programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, care for our veterans, and all of the programs and services that are so vital to our communities, but unfortunately, as we know, are currently under attack. For more than 2 decades across both Republican and Democratic administrations, the Government Accountability Office identified federal property management as a significant challenge, including problems of excess and underutilized space and poor building conditions. All of that is to say that this is a long-standing issue that many administrations have worked on, and it certainly isn't something new. My colleagues and I have consistently worked to improve stewardship of federal real estate so it can better serve the American people, and that is why I would love to make this a bipartisan hearing about how we address the needs of this country and best serve the people of this nation. The last administration disposed of properties saving nearly $2 billion for American taxpayers, and recently Congress worked together to pass bills for additional tools to reform and consolidate the federal property inventory. These efforts also directed the sale of 4 federal buildings, including the one we are here in today. The Inflation Reduction Act also helped to facilitate property consolidation, including reducing the Department of Homeland Security footprint by over 1 million square feet and saving taxpayers over $1 billion over 30 years. But instead of building on these successes and continuing to do what could be characterized as the tedious analytical work on behalf of Americans, the Trump administration is currently taking a fire sale approach of looting the federal government and stripping it for parts to pay for tax cuts that we know will come up in their reconciliation deal. Let's be clear. Republicans are trying to pass legislation right now that would give billionaires permanent tax breaks on the order of $37 trillion over the next 3 decades. And in order to pay for that, they are looting the federal government and taking a page out of the playbook of private equity. Take public assets, privatize them, sell them for profit, lease them back, help your buddies make money. And that is exactly what we're seeing here today. And unfortunately, we've seen this across the federal government since the Trump administration took office. In fact, we have been deeply concerned that the entire doge effort has been a front to help support billionaires who are trying to privatize public services. And just this week, we have seen, as Elon Musk is on his exit out of the federal government, he has secured billions of dollars in new contracts across the federal government. Conflict of interest? Yes, absolutely. It appears that he has recently secured contracts and promises for contracts at the Department of Defense, NASA. He has installed Starlink at the White House and is asking to install it at other federal agencies. And we understand that there is the potential to potentially deploy his AI technology across the federal agencies to replace the tens of thousands of federal employees that have recently been illegally fired. That is why we are deeply concerned about the non-data-driven fire sale that the Trump administration is proposing for federal properties, such as the one we're in today. So, I am deeply distraught and dismayed that we do not have an administration witness with us here today, that GSA is not here to answer questions, that yet again Elon Musk is not in front of this committee, and unfortunately we have yet to see a single Trump political appointee in front of this committee or the Oversight Committee. So, we will continue to do our jobs to elucidate what is happening inside the federal government. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today, and I look forward to talking about how we can actually manage federal properties and the federal workforce to continue to provide the vital services that are needed for the American people. Finally, I just want to say that it is quite rich to talk about the abuse of federal properties after Donald Trump used the historic Postal Service building just down the street during his administration to make millions and millions of dollars from foreign governments while they came and visited him in the Oval Office. So let's make sure that we are doing right by the American people and doing things in a way that is transparent and also in the interest of the public. And with that, I yield back.
Without objection, Rep. Brown from Ohio is waived on to the subcommittee for the purpose of questioning the witnesses at today's hearing. I'm pleased now to introduce today's witnesses. Mr. David Maroney is a director in GOA's physical infrastructure team. He oversees work on federal real property management and the U.S. Postal Service. Mr. Maroney joined GAO in 2004. Mr. John Hart is CEO of Open the Books. Mr. Hart is a veteran of Capitol Hill, having served in the late U.S. Representative and Senator Tom Coburn's longtime communications director and co-author. Mr. Hart helped enact landmark transparency legislation to put federal spending online. Mr. Ron Kendall is the Executive Chairman Emeritus at the National Federal Development Association. He previously served in senior roles in the federal government, including within GSA's Public Buildings Service. Again, I want to thank you all for being here to testify today. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So how much of this real estate is actually being put to use, or what it's worth on the open market? Here's what we do know. Taxpayers spend about $10 billion annually just to operate and maintain all of it. American taxpayers have been drowning in debt, inflation, unaffordable grocery prices, high interest rates, and have been suffering to get by. All while the federal government is pouring billions of dollars into wasteful, empty office buildings and luxurious high-end furniture, which they, the American taxpayers, can't even afford themselves. It's quite a hypocrisy. These buildings sat largely empty during the entire Biden administration, which kept federal office workers at home long after the COVID-19 pandemic ended. By the way, truck drivers, first responders, so many people worked during the pandemic, but federal workers could stay home, and these federal buildings sat empty. Here in D.C., GAO found in 2023 that the vast majority of federal agency headquarter buildings were less than 25% occupied, some much less. Meanwhile, from 2022 to 2024, the backlog of deferred maintenance on the aging buildings the government owns grew from $216 billion to $370 billion. That's more than $1/3 of $1 trillion it will cost to restore them if we don't sell them. What's worse, aside from paying for useless leases and allowing federal buildings to decay, the Biden administration spent billions on high-end furniture for empty buildings during the pandemic. No one was sitting in those chairs or at those desks. Our witness from Open the Books will testify to that. It is only now, under the Trump administration, that we see a light at the end of the tunnel. This administration is taking historic action on reducing the size of the government, and with it, a significant reduction in the useless office space that is claimed to be essential for the government to operate. GSA has established a goal to reduce the size of the federally owned real estate footprint by 50%. This is a massive real estate auction. The President issued an executive order instructing agencies to update their property inventory and to determine which of their government-leased or government-owned spaces they don't need. In just the few months since Inauguration Day, DOGE and the General Services Administration have sold off several federal properties and worked with agencies to eliminate hundreds of unneeded taxpayer-funded office leases. More specifically, they've canceled nearly 700 federal leases of 7.9 million square feet of space, saving taxpayers around $400 million. One of the canceled leases was a nearly $250 million 15-year lease at a luxury office building on Pennsylvania Avenue to house Voice of America and the United States Agency for Global Media. The Biden administration signed the lease late last year, sticking taxpayers with the tab. It's one of the fanciest office buildings in the city. You can see of the building on this poster board. Incredible. Furthermore, this beautiful building had zero broadcasting capabilities, a capability one would think would be essential for a broadcasting media agency. The cost to taxpayers to build out the building with broadcasting capabilities, $130 million. The Biden team wanted to move USAGM and Voice of America from this building that we are sitting in today into that luxury space. Instead, the president is shutting down the whole state-run media operation, and taxpayers will be spared a $250 million lease and millions more for renovations and security measures. This is just one example of countless egregious abuses of leases and contracts being paid out across the federal government. Another egregious abuse of taxpayer dollars regarding federal property was the $200 million the FBI received last year for a new headquarters in Maryland. While the FBI was going after the American people, parents at school board meetings, and many others, our federal government gave them hundreds of millions of dollars of American tax dollars for a brand new, beautiful headquarters. Federal agencies shouldn't be maintaining empires at taxpayer expense. That's why GSA, the federal landlord agency driving this reform process, plans to lead by example. Imagine that. It intends to vacate its current headquarters building in downtown D.C. and co-locate with another agency. Then it will sell the GSA headquarters. Before I close, I'll note that Congress also acted on this front in January. We passed a law requiring federal building occupancy to be tracked and for low occupancy buildings to be sold. But it will take a willing partner in the White House to implement that law and to take other steps to shrink the federal real estate empire. We now have that partner, and I look forward to working with the Trump administration and DOGE to finally right-size the federal real estate footprint. And with that, I yield to Ranking Member Stansbury for her opening statement.
All right. Well, good morning. I always enjoy a field hearing, and it's nice to be out in the field here in Washington. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Maroney, I'm grateful that you're here. I know in the report that GAO has published that real estate of the federal government has been on the high-risk list since 2003, and part of that is that we're not disposing of it and taking care of it in as quickly a process is needed. So I think this is an issue that we have bipartisan agreement on. Certainly, if you're overinvested in assets, it's something that you need to deal with as a business. But, I'm a former OMB employee. I was a nonpartisan a federal official, and I worked on the Department of Interior's portfolio. And one of the things that the American public may not realize is that when the federal government is trying to figure out how to reconfigure its federal property footprint, there's a whole planning process that begins. So you first work with the federal agencies. You identify, are they going to change the configuration of how they're using space based on sharing of desk space? If there's laboratories needed, do they need to be physically located in certain spaces? This is what any company does, right? They try to figure out where their employees are going to be located. Then there's a planning process with the actual real estate itself, because in many cases you can't dispose of your leases without investing in construction and improvements because of the terms of a lease, if it's a lease, or if you're trying to dispose of the property and get fair market value. So what I really want to highlight here is that we need an expedited process, but any private company or public entity would have to go through an extensive planning process to do it in a way that would get a fair shake for the taxpayers. Would you agree with that?
There's certainly planning steps you want to take.
Absolutely. So the idea of just putting out a list of hundreds of federal properties, including some of the most valuable real estate in Washington, D.C. on the federal mall, including the headquarters of every major federal agency, is not a planning process. That is a fire sale of some of the most valuable real estate properties in Washington, D.C. Now, we all know that Donald Trump is a real estate developer. Let's not lose sight of that. And certainly he understands the significance of the disposal of properties in the most valuable real estate in our nation's capital. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind as we're thinking about, is the intentions of what DOGE is doing, are they actually in the public interest? And Mr. Maroney, I want to also go back to kind of the bigger economic context, because I think it actually relates to the issues that we're dealing with this week in the House. In fact, Donald Trump has put into place tariffs last week that are causing the markets to tank. Right now, the economy is in complete free fall, and House Republicans are whipping votes to try to get this new package across the finish line that would give permanent tax breaks to billionaires, and the markets are completely shook by it. And I know this is outside your purview, but the issue here is that anyone who works in real estate right now knows that this is not a good time to sell real estate. Would you agree with that?
It is a challenging time, particularly in commercial offices.
Absolutely. So that's the point I want to make. If we're talking about actually getting value for the taxpayers, then doing a fire sale of federal properties and then putting into place expensive leases where the federal government would spend federal taxpayer dollars to lease back from private entities at this moment as the market is in free fall and the real estate market is in complete tanking at the moment is not a good use of taxpayer dollars. Like, this is a terrible idea at this moment, and it needs to be done through a sane process. Now, Mr. Hart, I was interested in your testimony, and I actually just want to follow up. You used in your testimony a bunch of times this concept of dismantling the administrative state. And so I'm just curious, do you view the disposal of federal real estate as part of dismantling the administrative state?
No, I view it as empowering taxpayers and transferring wealth from Washington to individual Americans. So I think it's probably one of the best economic stimulus programs you could have.
May I ask, Mr. Hart, is your agenda?
Strongly oppose OMB and OPM's recent directive to federal agencies to, quote, propose relocations of agency, bureaus, and offices from Washington, D.C. and the National Capital Region to less costly parts of the country, end quote. I also strongly oppose the many bills that have been introduced this Congress to relocate the headquarters for federal agencies in the National Capital Region to outside the National Capital Region. These relocations, as we saw during the first Trump administration, would harm the operations of these agencies and waste taxpayer dollars. They would also harm the economy of the National Capital Region and upend the lives of federal workers, many with kids who love their homes and schools. Last month, I introduced a bill to prohibit such relocations. However, there are specific federal buildings in D.C. that GSA should dispose of in an orderly manner and move the employees from those buildings into other buildings in D.C. These disposals would save the federal government money and could generate tax revenue for D.C., increase housing supply, and create new mixed-use neighborhoods in the District of Columbia. There is precedent for orderly disposals of federal property in D.C. Congress has passed many of my bipartisan bills to transfer unused or underutilized federal buildings and land in D.C. to the D.C. government or the private sector, including the Webster School, the development of the wharf and the yards, and most recently the RFK Stadium campus. Mr. Kendall, I believe that there needs to be an orderly process for disposing of federal buildings in D.C. as opposed to putting many federal buildings up for sale at the same time. How would putting many federal buildings in D.C. up for sale at the same time affect the price the federal government could get for the buildings and the value of commercial real estate in D.C. generally?
Congresswoman Norton, selling into a down market is not a sagacious plan. As Ranking Member Stansbury said, that's a kind of fire sale approach. Vacancy in the office market in Washington, D.C., and I've been here for 47 years, it's the highest rate of vacancy in four and a half decades. You don't sell into a down market. That is, it's folly. You're going to get the lowest price possible if you can move the assets at all. I mean, there is, of course, McKinney-Vento, as the congressman just made some could go the homeless way, and others might be public benefit discount conveyances, and you get nothing. But the point is, it is not, you're loading up a market with that's already under distress. So it's cataclysmic.
Well, 3 months ago, Congress passed the Bipartisan Water Resources Development Act, which established a clear federal standard requiring GSA to identify buildings for potential consolidation or disposal, specifically any with an occupancy rate below 60%. However, I'm concerned that GSA is trying to dispose of federal buildings without looking at data to judge whether the buildings are needed or not. Mr. Marjorie, based on the timeline established in the recent law, when do you expect the GSA would have the information needed to make more informed decisions about private property?
City of D.C. was that continuing resolution that defunded approximately $1 billion from them, but I will focus on today's hearing. The Republicans' recklessness and chaotic approach to reducing the size of government has shown us what we've already known. Concepts of a plan don't work. This is the committee's fourth hearing, and still no one from the so-called Department of Government Efficiency has testified before this committee about their plans to break the federal government, because as it turns out, breaking the federal government doesn't just hurt people you don't like. It's not just going to be Democrats who miss out on Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, or only Democratic veterans who will miss out on their VA benefits. Their approach will negatively impact all Americans. So it's unfortunate that Republicans have taken a seemingly bipartisan issue and included it as part of their scam to subsidize tax giveaway for billionaires. They haven't proposed anything that will improve the efficiency of the government. Instead, they have put the country on a path to a recession and implemented the largest tax increase on Americans in decades through Trump's tariffs. This hearing is their latest attempt to try to convince the American people that dismantling public-facing agencies will somehow improve government efficiency. Let me tell you, it won't. There's nothing efficient about terminating leases for IRS taxpayer assistance centers during tax season, nor dismantling farmers' support offices in rural communities while farmers are trying to survive Trump's tariffs. And just like their trade policy, there isn't any logic or strategy behind the Trump administration's reductions in force or accelerated disposal of federally owned property. It has been discussed that managing federal property has been on GAO's high-risk list for more than 2 decades. Currently, GAO has almost 60 recommendations that the administration could fully implement, but decided to ignore. And I'm going to veer off for 2 seconds because all I kept hearing was fire. Fire, fire, fire is what I heard. And as I heard fire, it seems like We are talking about an administration that has been hell-bent on firing government workers. They are hell-bent on engaging in fire sales of our government buildings. And while we are at it, they are lighting the Social Security on fire, Medicaid on fire, Medicare on fire, 401ks on fire, Department of Education on fire. And instead, what we need to light on fire are Trump's tariffs. In fact, we could probably go a little bit further and fire this incompetent administration. But if we are going to talk about efficiency and worry about some solar paneled whatevers, let's talk about the fact that as of March 30th, Trump's golfing has cost us approximately $26 million. And the last time I checked, we're not getting anything in return for that. So I will get back on my remarks, but I just wanted to point out that maybe we need to talk about the president and his golfing habits. In fact, he decided that he was going to golf as the markets were tanking. He decided he was going to golf instead of receiving 4 heroes who died serving this country. He has decided that he wanted to play games while the rest of us are really trying to make sure that we can serve the American people. So, Mr. Maroney, you were quoted in the New York Times article dated March 17th, stating that it is important for officials to have a plan to generate the most savings and that, quote, all of these moving parts point to the need for some deliberate planning. Did the administration consult with GAO regarding their plans to dispose of hundreds of federally owned buildings?
No.
In your testimony, you highlight that one of the core issues associated with managing federal property is the lack of reliable data to support decision-making. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would reducing GSA's workforce by 50% improve data gathering and analysis?
I cannot say they're
That's
not
perfectly
perfect.
fine. We know that we need experts and not idiots. But Mr. Kendall, we will move on. In your written testimony, you state some of the actions of this administration suggest that the administration is not following a strategy designed to save taxpayer money and that the administration seems to ignore agency's mission integrity. Why do you think that?
At another hearing where House Republicans are trying to help Elon Musk get cover for looting our federal government. Doge, and so far this committee has not been about efficiency or better services. It's been an attack on programs that we rely on, from public health to Medicaid to the Department of Education, and of course now to office space. And we all know that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are attacking all the safeguards designed to make sure they just can't sell our government assets to their own companies, but they can also sell them to their friends. Our committee is ignoring the biggest threat from the Trump administration so far, and that is a horrific economic plan, Maganomics. Now, Mr. Kendall, we've been hearing testimony complaining that the federal government spent $4.6 billion on furniture since 2021. Do you know how much the U.S. businesses will pay every year in tariffs under Donald Trump's plan? Any idea?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay, well, the U.S. businesses will be paying $654 billion a year, and that number will rise. And that's just in 1 year. That number, of course, is enormously much larger than anything that we ever spend in furniture. We're looking at the biggest tax increase in over 50 years. Now, Mr. Kendall, the total value of all property held by the federal government is about $330 billion, as stated. Is that correct?
I have no basis to challenge that number.
Okay, great. So do you know how much wealth has been wiped out from the stock market in just 2 days after Donald Trump's tariff announcement? Any idea, Mr. Kendall?
It's in the trillions, but I don't know the
Around
number.
$6.6 trillion. So I want to make sure what people should be understanding here. Last week, we had the largest 2-day stock market fall in history. We're talking about furniture and office space while people are losing their retirement accounts, while the stock market is crashing, while Medicaid is under attack, while healthcare costs are going up. We know that retirement accounts are being wiped out right now as we are holding this hearing. Companies, many of them, are no longer able to invest. People are losing their jobs. And we're here talking about furniture while Donald Trump is destroying the economy. We also know that predicting a recession, which many are now doing, is looking more and more likely, which we hope, of course, doesn't actually happen. And while all this was happening and Donald Trump was imposing his tariffs plan, and the prices of almost everything, groceries, housing, clothing, computers, can be expected to go up, Donald Trump, of course, the next day left to go play golf. Now, Mr. Kendall, Were you aware that as the markets were crashing, Donald Trump the next day went out to play a few rounds of golf?
I do read the papers, so I did know that.
And perhaps maybe instead he should have been working with world leaders or allies to actually work on the tariff crisis. But instead, of course, he was, of course, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which is a very conservative paper, as we know. I think it's clear that Donald Trump could care less about the harm he's doing, doesn't care about American workers or the community. And unfortunately, Republicans in Congress want to debate office space and furniture while the president torches our own American economy and the global economy. We have businesses right now, back in my district and across the country, that are getting hammered and suffering and firing employees. But instead, we're continuing to have these really unfortunate, I think, hearings. It's crazy. It's cowardly. We should stop the tariffs now. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Burchett from Tennessee.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Thank you for indulgence and allowing me to be on this committee.
Woman, I hope that in some ways this hearing has been elucidating, but I'm going to be honest, just listening here today, I've had trouble understanding the theory of the case. Now, anyone who's in business knows that if you're going to go in front of a boardroom and present your case, you've got to have compelling data, you've got to have an analysis of what you're trying to accomplish, you've got to have an analysis of the money that you're going to save, and a proposal and a plan for how you're going to execute that. And I think the thing that is troubling about the entire DOGE exercise is that it doesn't seem to have a coherent theory. It doesn't appear to have a plan. It doesn't appear to be utilizing data. And it doesn't appear to be executing on any kind of coherent theory of how we're saving money for the federal government, because as we learned here today, it will actually cost the federal government more money if they sell these vital assets to private companies who will then lease them back to federal agencies for more money. So it's troubling to try to understand, and I think it kind of goes along with the troubling theory of the case that Donald Trump seems to have about the economy overall, because as my colleague pointed out, we're sitting here talking about microphones and furniture in an office building while the economy is tanking and trillions of dollars in losses are happening, and we know that the potential for both a recession and costs are going to go up, which will cost the federal government more money. So what's the theory of the case here? I've also heard conflicting theories just about this very building that we're sitting in. Is this building too fancy, or does this building need to be demolished to make way for housing? It's not even clear what the argument is for this building that we're sitting in, having this field hearing in. Now, what I think is interesting about what we heard here today is that some of the quiet part was said out loud. In fact, what was stated by some of the other members on this panel was that they'd like to sell valuable real estate to private developers, potentially demolish federal buildings like this, sell them potentially to private equity and developers, and then they can lease back and make money off of it. And that's exactly what this scheme is all about, because this is what we're seeing across the entire DOGE effort and across the administration. And this is not really about public interest. This is, as we keep saying, the private equity model. Privatize, buy low, sell high, make lots of money. This is what the DOGE bros are all about. But we know that there is real data coming in July, as was stated by the GAO, that will help us take a data-driven approach. This is data that was demanded by Congress. It is bipartisan. Let's come up with a plan if we're actually going to deal with this bipartisan issue. Now, I also want to point out some other ironies and inconsistencies that we heard here today. One of my colleagues quoted Milton Friedman, which I found actually quite funny, because Elon Musk himself has also been quoting Milton Friedman over the weekend because he thought that international trade was good and tariffs were bad. Anybody? Donald Trump is crashing the economy over tariffs. We also heard my colleagues across the aisle talk about right-sizing and righting the fiscal ship, while they're literally about to try to vote tomorrow on a budget proposal that will increase the deficit by $37 trillion over the next 30 years. This would raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion just this year and would cost the United States the largest amount of debt ever in the history of its 250 years. So, again, I don't understand the theory of the case. If what we're about here is trying to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, make the government more efficient, save the government money, then why on earth is Donald Trump trying to tank the economy? What are they trying to do with the sell-off and privatization of the federal government? What are they trying to do with downsizing and firing thousands of federal employees? So I'll close out by saying this. To my friends across the aisle and to the administration, hands off our Social Security, hands off our Medicaid, hands off our Medicare, hands off the VA, hands off our education, and hands off our vital programs and the services and the federal assets that make them possible. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize myself for closing remarks. Thank you for our witnesses coming today. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you to the American people for tuning in into what is an extremely important issue. Your Social Security is not under attack. Medicare is not under attack. Veterans' benefits are not under attack. But our very existence is under attack. And this has happened by dirty, greedy, lazy politicians and bureaucrats who have plunged you and chained you in $36 trillion in debt. You are under attack, and you've been under attack by your own federal government. We're here today proudly to talk about how we can reduce this debt, and this is a bipartisan issue. Selling federal property and returning the money back to the American people is the right way to protect you. And as Republicans, we believe in this, and we proudly stand with President Trump, Elon Musk, and their doge efforts to reduce the size of the federal government, reduce the federal debt. And we are so grateful, and definitely America voted for President Trump to stand up for Americans, the American worker, and American companies with tariffs that return the order back to America and defeat the globalists who have attacked American interests, stolen intellectual property from American companies, and have turned rural America into a graveyard of factories that have been shut down and American jobs that have been shipped overseas. So I want to say directly, thank you, President Trump, for standing up for us. And we will be so happy when you stick up for us and make it fair again through these tariffs. The federal government's management of its massive real estate portfolio has been problematic for decades. Everyone knows it. The United States is $36 trillion in debt. In fiscal year 24, the government spent over $1.8 trillion more than it took in. And in fiscal year 25, the interest on our debt is expected to exceed $1 trillion. Many Americans are suffering every day while the federal government continues to recklessly spend hard-earned taxpayer dollars to foot the bill of luxurious, high-end furniture for offices, or on the flip side, carelessly waste billions on unused buildings and leases. Young people cannot afford to buy a house. For today's 27-year-olds, only 33% own their homes versus 40% of baby boomers when they were 27. From 2019 to 2024, housing prices in my home state of Georgia increased by up to 67%, as did areas all across the country. Everything went up. Life became unaffordable. Over the past 4 years under Democrats, overall inflation hit 20%. The cost of food increased nearly 34%, and the cost of energy increased nearly 33%, and credit card debt was up nearly 50%. As Americans racked up grocery bills, credit card debt, and couldn't afford to buy a home, the federal bureaucrats recklessly spend their money without a care in the world. In the last year, 7 in 10 Americans completed at least one DIY project. Do it yourself. And nearly 50% said it was because they couldn't afford professionals to do it. Americans are either renovating their own houses by themselves because they can't afford to hire a company to do it, or in many cases, they will have to go without. What do federal bureaucrats do when they need to renovate a conference room or redecorate an office? They spend $700,000 and $6.5 million of your money to do it. American businesses can't afford these types of upgrades. And the reality is that the federal government is $36 trillion in debt and can't afford it either. As we continue investigating waste, fraud, and abuse, we can look no further. The unconscionable amount of spending that the federal government spends on empty buildings and brand new high-end furnitures and something as ridiculous as solar-powered picnic tables. Every year, taxpayers have to spend about $10 billion just to operate and maintain it all, in addition to backlog of deferred maintenance that is now up to $370 billion. In 2023, GAO reported that 17 of the 24 largest federal agencies used 25% or less of their headquarters buildings capacity, and none of these agencies ever utilized more than 49% of the building's capacity in an average week. I just want to inform you that all happened at the same time when homeless rates skyrocketed and veterans were kicked out to make room for illegal aliens. When you own property in the real world, if you breach a term of your mortgage agreement, you mismanage your finances, or you miss payments, the lender will repossess your property and auction it off. While the federal government can't miss payments because they will just print more money, they have grossly mismanaged their finances, and it is time for the American people to evict federal bureaucrats, repossess the properties, and auction them off to the highest bidder. Thankfully, the American people now have the president on their side. While the previous administration did little to address the problems laid out here today, we're finally seeing meaningful progress under President Trump. The early successes of selling off unused properties and canceling wasteful leases by the Department of Government Efficiency shows what can be accomplished with strong leadership. With Congress and the Trump administration working together, I'm confident we can finally resolve this decades-old problem and deliver the results and the money back to the American taxpayers. With that and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. If there is